So welcome to the research seminar for CSAC. And I'm Rod Ewing. I'm a co-director here at CSAC, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's discussion. Today we have a team of three to make the presentation. I'll give you the title in a moment. Starting from left to right is William Potter, Sam Nunn, and Richard Lugar, Professor of Nonproliferation Studies and Founding Director of the Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. Then next, Sarah Bidgood, Stanton Foundation Nuclear Security Fellow in the MIT Securities Program. And prior to this, she served as the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey. And then to the far right, Hanna Notte is the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and a senior associate
using up all of our time.
Yeah, with Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Their bios are much longer than the titles that I've given you, but to save time, I'll just refer you to the announcement for the meeting. Today, they're here to present a new book. The title is Death Dust: The Rise, Decline, and Future of Radiological Weapons Programs. And we'll start with an introduction by Professor Potter.
Hey, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to return to CSAC. I learned just a moment ago that although I thought I was one of the early members of CSAC, I actually preceded the formal institution. I was here in the 1970s with John Lewis and company. So I feel a special affection for Stanford. And it's also really a pleasure to be back today, because this is the first time we will have given a book talk about the new book that Stanford University Press published this past December. So what we're going to do is the following. I'm going to say a few words by way of introduction, kind of a rationale for the book and its origins. I'm then going to ask Sarah and Hanna both to speak a little bit about several of the case studies that we've undertaken, and also to try to derive some lessons across the cases. And then I'll wrap up with some comments about the potential for further proliferation, looking particularly at the case of the war in Ukraine and its impact, and also say a few words about a new U.S. government initiative to try to prevent the use of radiological weapons. So this is an instance in which I can very, very precisely date the moment at which the conception of the idea formed. And it was at Wilson Park in September 2000. I had earlier terrorism, which among other things looked at the protection of duty bombs in Iraq, and was familiar with the fact that almost every study that I was aware of, sought out my colleague, Jeffrey Lewis, and we decided that it made some sense to look at these issues. In the course of our research, we were surprised to discover that there was, in fact, precedent for state use, not state use, but state pursuit of radiological weapons. The United States, actually in the period prior to the start of U.S. engagement in the Second World War, and there was also some references to British activities in that area. And so we published a piece in Foreign Policy. Then I was so intrigued, I thought we should really pursue this further. And so tapping Sarah Bidgood, who was then with me in Monterey, and another former student, Sam Meyer, we launched a book project to examine particularly the US and Soviet cases, but we began to look elsewhere as well. And that led to an article in International Security in 2020. And then because we wanted to focus on the cases of Egypt and Iraq, and we really didn't have the language skills to do that, we were able to recruit Sarah or Hanna Notte to join us, and that led to then this book. So I want to emphasize again, from a methodological standpoint, that we are narrowly focused on the issue of state-level pursuit of radiological weapons. We don't dispute the importance of non-state activity in this form of nuclear violence, but that has been looked at many times before, and so ours is a rather different orientation. We're not primarily interested in theory building. Our work is informed by a substantial literature on military innovation and organizational change. And our work, while eclectic, I think can be identified most closely with the approach that my former mentor at Stanford, a dear friend, Alexander George, pioneered, which was the method of structured focused comparison. So that's the approach that we followed. Maybe worth noting at the outset that we try carefully to distinguish between an invention, which is the process by which a new idea or concept is created, innovation, which is a process by which an invention is translated into a tangible product adopted by an organization, such as a military entity, and diffusion, which is a process by which an idea or a product spreads to or is emulated by another organization. Invention precedes innovation, but diffusion does not presuppose adoption of the new idea for a weapons system. I'm mentioning this fact because the distinctions, I think, are important in understanding our findings, that in no instance across the 5 cases that we look at very carefully, were radiological weapons ever adopted for deployment by a military, despite their having been tested in 3 instances, and we'll say more about that, or my colleagues will in a moment. And finally, I would note that most of our research involved the use of archival information that had not been tapped previously, with the exception of several studies of the early US program, including by Stanford's Barton Bernstein, and an excellent, very recent article by William King on the British program. And as Hanna will describe it in more detail, we also make, I think, very interesting use of court records involving the Swiss-German court case of one of the principal promoter of radiological weapons in the Egyptian case. So with that, let me turn to Sarah.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about the pursuit of radiological weapons in 2 cases, the United States and the Soviet Union. And as Bill alluded to in his opening comments, initial enthusiasm for radiological weapons in the US really emerged in the 1940s against the backdrop of World War II. And what we found in our research is that it was stoked in large part by concerns that Nazi Germany was planning to develop this kind of capability. But one thing that I found quite interesting in the course of our research is that this enthusiasm for radiological weapons was also born to some extent of a larger exploration of the military uses of nuclear fission. So the concept of radiological weapons in some of these early documents that Bill referenced aren't really wholly distinct from nuclear weapons, which of course the US was also pursuing at the same time. So we see this borne out in the first government document to address radiological weapons in the US case, which was a 1941 report by the Committee on Atomic Fission, which was part of the US National Academy of Sciences, which identified what it called the production of violently radioactive materials carried by airplanes to be scattered as bombs over enemy territory as just one of 3 possible military uses of atomic fission. We also see this kind of enmeshing of radiological weapons and nuclear weapons in the fact that the Met Lab had an offensive and defensive radiological warfare on its list of research objectives up through December of 1943. Now, because of the war, it was several years before this initial kind of probing and interest in radiological weapons actually went anywhere. But when it did, it enjoyed quite a bit of high-level support, including from people like Curtis LeMay, Edward Teller, and Ernest Lawrence. When you read our case study on the US program, you'll see that we trace the active pursuit of radiological weapons in the United States to 1946, when Joseph Hamilton of the Berkeley Lab wrote a memo to the Army Corps of Engineers about the military advantages of radiological weapons. And in response to that memo, the US Atomic Energy Commission actually appointed a panel to study the issue, and they ended up recommending that the DoD pursue a full-fledged radiological weapons program. This was fortuitous timing. These efforts found a ready champion in the Army Chemical Corps, which was already at this point looking for a new raison d'etre after nuclear weapons had sort of forced some resources and support away from its core mission. So they ended up being put in charge of designing and testing radiological weapons, and they conducted dozens of open air tests of various prototype munitions at the Dugway Proving Ground between 1949 and 1953. Now, most of these prototypes used tantalum-182 as their radioactive payload for a couple of reasons. First, it had this sort of Goldilocks half-life. It was perfect for tactical area denial. It was 114 days. But there were also supply chain considerations at play here too. So tantalum was appealing because, at least in theory, it could be irradiated at the Hanford plutonium reactor during its normal operation, rather than requiring there to be expensive dedicated facilities for this purpose to be used in the radiological weapons program. We know from the historical record that the tests of these prototype weapons went, okay. They were successful in the sense that they functioned as they were designed to. They spread radiation over a considerable area. But at the end of the day, as Bill said, they never made it to the point of mass production and deployment. One reason for this that we identify in our study is that even those individuals and institutional advocates who had been intrigued by or even excited by the prospect of radiological weapons coming out of World War II didn't really see these munitions as particularly useful for fulfilling priority military missions and objectives. And another reason that we identify for the failure of these weapons to complete the innovation cycle is that radiological weapons were competing with both chemical weapons and nuclear weapons for funding and for high-level attention. And because they seem to offer less military utility than these other 2 kinds of weapons, they never really came out on top. So the upshot of all of this is that the radiological weapons program ended in 1956, long before these weapons completed the military innovation cycle. What did things look like in the Soviet Union? The contours of this case were much more challenging, I would say, to sort of tease out than the American case, in part because, as anyone knows who does Soviet research, we don't have that robust declassified documentary record that we have on the United States side. But we were able to piece together the basic outline of this program, in part thanks to excellent reporting by the Bologna Foundation, who had looked at some of this history before, but also thanks to new archival documents that we identified in this really robust digital library that Rosatom actually hosts on its website that's filled with primary source documents that I would be happy to recommend to anybody if they're interested in continuing some of this work. And what we found when we did this is that, much as was the case in the United States, Soviet interest can be traced to 1940. We had a pair of physical mathematicians who submitted a proposal to the Soviet Bureau of Inventions on the use of uranium as an explosive and poisoning substance. But unlike in the United States, where these kind of initial probings and interest in radiological weapons received some fairly high-level attention early on, these were dismissed in the Soviet case. So things only really started to change when the USSR started to figure out that perhaps the United States was pursuing a radiological weapons capability, or at least defense in this area, which then sparked a 2-year kind of preliminary period of research on defensive radiological efforts in this regard. From what we can tell, the USSR learned about these efforts through a couple of different channels. One was the Smythe Report, which actually talked about US work on defensive radiological weapons and the potential utility of radioactive poisons. This, we found from the documentary record, had been translated into Russian in 1946 and was distributed among high-level members of the defense establishment. But another likely source was atomic spies, including Klaus Fuchs, whose name appears on some UK documents pertaining to radiological weapons, and Alan Nunn-May, who ended up confessing on his deathbed that he had actually passed along some findings to Moscow about plans for a Nazi dirty bomb, but he notes that the Russians were not very impressed by this, so I think they were more concerned about the Americans. Whatever the precise source of this information, though, the security threat posed by foreign pursuit of radiological weapons drove the USSR to respond. And in an interesting parallel to the United States, responsibility for that initial research on how to defend against radiological weapons was assigned to the Soviet chemical weapons enterprise. It's hard to say exactly when this research took on an offensive dimension, but we know that in late 1947, Lavrentiy Beria's deputy, whose last name is Vannikov, wrote a letter to Stalin about the potential military applications of radiological weapons. And within just a few years, by the beginning of the 1950s, the Soviet Union had this active offensive radiological weapons program. The Soviet Navy had some special responsibilities in this area, so it took charge of developing and testing radioactive munitions. 2 directorates were set up for this purpose in St. Petersburg, and their responsibility was to take radioactive waste, to mix it with different substrates, and then test it in different formulations on mostly animals. They inadvertently tested it on themselves, as we learned from the record, and there are some pretty harrowing stories about that. This radioactive mixture was then tested in different munitions like air bombs and cluster munitions at Semipalatinsk between 1954 and 1956, possibly as late as 1957, and in prototype warheads that were tested at Kapustin Yar. But just like in the United States, none of these ever made it to the point of mass production and deployment. And by about 1958, the program had reached the end of its life. So in contrast with the US case, which ended quite abruptly, the Soviet radiological weapons program appears to have withered away over time, probably as a result of several different factors, which I'll just name very quickly before turning it over to Hanna. First, just as was true in the US, the USSR determined that radiological weapons really came up short in terms of military effectiveness, especially when compared with chemical weapons, which filled a very similar role and mission set. Second, the Soviet Union didn't have kind of unlimited slack resources, which are really important for military innovation. And as you can hopefully get a sense for from what I'm saying, they had a huge kind of infrastructure developed for the pursuit of radiological weapons. So the fact that the end result wasn't all that effective beyond the kinds of capabilities that the USSR already had, I think made it seem like it wasn't really worth the investment. And that also contributed to the program's demise. And then finally, we suspect that changes in perceived threats probably played a role here too. Given that one of the initial drivers behind the USSR's pursuit of radiological weapons was thinking that the United States was already doing this. So it makes a lot of sense that after the US abandoned its program, the Soviet Union would follow suit shortly thereafter. So let me stop here and turn things over to Hanna.
Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah just noted that the US and Soviet programs ended or fizzled out in the late 1950s. It would be a few more years until the Egyptians start looking at radiological weapons. And I must say that this case study was really fun to research and also very difficult because it rests so much on circumstantial evidence. Sometimes it felt like compiling a spy novel working on this because we have some Israeli government allegations, we have some US government memos, but to a large degree, we have to rely on the testimony and deposition of one Austrian scientist, Otto Joklik, who was the chief weaponeer behind this effort. And Otto Joklik, who was Austrian by descent, born in 1921, had served in the German army in World War II, was a nuclear scientist. He was one of those scientists who was recruited by Egypt in the late 1950s, among other German scientists, to work on Egypt's various non-conventional weapons programs and missile programs. And what Otto Joklik claims after he defected to Israel and possibly became an Israel intelligence asset, is that for about 6 months, he was in Cairo exploring a radiological weapons effort, Project IBIS, to develop artillery shells filled with radioactive isotopes. And he then fled, went to Israel, was questioned. You have also this fascinating situation where some in the Israeli intelligence community thought that his claims were credible, others didn't so much. So this issue also created a sort of split within the Israeli intelligence community. But the effort was largely abandoned after Yoklek left Egypt. In terms of the drivers of this, we call it really an Egyptian flirtation with radiological weapons as opposed to a full-fledged program. We situate the interest in Egypt's foreign and security policy at the time, late 1950s, early 1960s, under President Nasser, at a time when Egypt became increasingly concerned with what it perceived to be a growing qualitative military edge by Israel. This was shortly after Israel had revealed the Dimona reactor in the Negev desert in 1960. And so the Egyptians grew concerned over that. And there's also some evidence that Nasser himself regarded progress on the Egyptian missile program and other non-conventional weapons as a matter of prestige for Egypt, which sought leadership in the Arab world at the time. But what we don't have in this case is any evidence that Yoklek or the Egyptians who he claims had knowledge of this effort or were involved were tying radiological weapons to any specific concept of deterrence or an operational concept held, pursued by the military establishment, such as area denial, as we will see in the Iraqi case. The Iraqis had quite a clear idea why they wanted to develop radiological weapons. There was no such thing in the Egyptian case. The effort was abandoned once Yoklek left Egypt, and so it seems quite clear that this project, I don't want to call it program, never was really prioritized by the Egyptian government, and we cannot know for sure to what extent the senior Egyptian leadership even had knowledge of this effort. We do know that this was a time in Egypt when, in terms of military innovation, a lot of different weapons projects were being pursued by different individuals. So there was a sort of conducive institutional environment for that. Turning quickly to the Iraqi program, that was far more real than the Egyptian program. It's the most recent case study in our book. The Iraqis looked at radiological weapons towards the end of their war with Iran. So after 1986, 1987 is when they tested 3 prototype bombs in the desert. And you had the Iraqi Military Industrial Corporation, MIC, which was also responsible for Iraq's chemical weapons, which were used extensively in the war against Iran, working together with the nuclear scientists at the Al Tuwaitha site, which also hosts the Osirak reactor that was bombed by the Israelis in 1981. They were working together on this program, and bombs were tested. And here we have evidence, an Iraqi progress report that was written in 1988 after those tests, but also in the 90s when the international inspectors went into Iraq, more evidence came to light about the Iraqi program. And so we know quite clearly that the Iraqis concretely pursued radiological weapons after a key inflection point in the Iran-Iraq war for area denial purposes against Iranian human wave attacks. There was also a conducive institutional context at the time because the Iraqis were throwing money and whoever they had after this turning point, the defeat at Al-Faw Peninsula, to develop more weapons to sort of generate momentum for themselves in this war against Iran, which by that point had been going on for many years. And Hussein Kamal, who was Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, headed the MIC and then also took over the leadership of the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission in 1987. He was a key individual who became quite convinced of this idea to pursue radiological weapons and sort of ran with it. It seems, however, that the Iraqi nuclear scientists didn't regard this as a priority. and possibly regarded as a technological dead end. And then the tests were unsuccessful that were carried out in the desert, and the Iraqis abandoned that program. What was somewhat interesting in terms of researching that case study was how evidence about it came to light. So I looked at the inspectors going into Iraq in the 1990s in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 687, which set up UNSCOM, and then we had the IAEA action team also going into Iraq. They were, of course, looking at the nuclear, the bio, and the chem programs, and no one was really looking at a radiological weapons program or was aware that the Iraqis had tested, which was partially due to Iraqi deception and the Iraqis obstructing inspectors. There was an absence of any foreign intelligence evidence pointing to the fact that the Iraqis had tried this, and of course also a lack of any physical evidence. And so it isn't until Hussein Kamal, that individual who was sort of taking the lead in this effort, defected to Jordan in 1995, that the Iraqi government wanted to beat Kamal to the punch, worrying that he would reveal something about this effort, that the Iraqi government itself comes forward with some information about this effort. Perhaps I'll end here and pass it back to you. Oh, no,
To me.
we will.
Yeah.
To Sarah. Sorry.
We've rehearsed this
Me, in
many
fact.
times.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Hanna. So what we're going to do next is just to draw a couple of concluding sort of observations about lessons to be learned across the cases. I'll start not with the lesson, but a generality that doesn't even extend to all of the cases, but it extends to two, and Bill and I find it quite interesting, which has to do with, the role of sort of popular fiction, science fiction in cultivating the ideas for radiological weapons, at least in the United States and the Soviet Union. So one of the things that I really enjoyed in researching this book was learning a little bit about the way that the general public and sort of the science fiction community thought about radiological weapons. We have these great examples, for instance, in 1941, which, as you'll remember, was also the year that the first US government document talking about the potential of radiological weapons came out. The legendary science fiction author Robert Heinlein, writing under a pseudonym, published a story in the magazine Astounding called Solution Unsatisfactory, which focused on sort of the development by a team of American scientists of a deadly radioactive dust. And just a few years later, in the mid-1940s, the incredibly popular comic strip Will Abner had a storyline that extended for several weeks that looked at radiological weapons and kind of focused on radiological weapons and their impact on Dogpatch. Of course, it's not clear, to what extent or whether the US pursuit of radiological weapons was in any way, inspired by or shaped by or influenced by what was being written about these weapons in sort of the popular discourse. But we definitely know that Manhattan Project participants read publications like Astounding. Edward Teller had actually read this very self-same story, Solution Unsatisfactory. So, we know that they were consuming this kind of material, and it's not impossible to imagine that science fiction and popular culture could have helped with the cultivation of the idea of radiological weapons, which is certainly an important part of the innovation process. The relationship between sci-fi and radiological weapons in the USSR looks a little bit different, but it's no less notable. We don't have as many overt examples of Soviet science fiction dealing with the topic like what we have in the United States, but that which does exist is extremely overt. In 1953, there was a Soviet propaganda film that was released called Silver Dust that focused on a fictitious, maybe, new military innovation, radioactive dust, that in the storyline was being developed by the United States and actually tested on African Americans. So it was very much a propaganda film. The movie is horrible. I mean, it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. You can watch it on YouTube, and it's quite interesting. But what is really notable for our purposes is that it was actually produced in consultation with Soviet specialists who studied the effects of nuclear weapons. And it was screened at Kapustin Yar for those who were involved in the testing of radiological weapons and actually identified as an example for them to follow in their work. So that's a very clear instance of this symbiotic relationship between sort of popular fiction and the military development of radiological weapons. But if science fiction maybe helped to inspire in some ways American and Soviet radiological weaponeers, what prevented these and other programs from reaching the stage of mass destruction and deployment, which, as you heard, is a unifying kind of characteristic of all of the cases that we looked at. I think the biggest issue that comes through for me in the cases is that radiological weapons as a technology just couldn't deliver what they promised to. Even though radiological weapons are thought of as sort of a poor man's nuclear bomb, it turns out it's actually pretty difficult to get enough radiological material of the right half-life so that it can be dispersed in the right ways to fulfill priority military missions. And as the Soviet case showed in particular, it was especially hard to do this without injuring or killing personnel in the process for little apparent gain. Another issue, I think, is that radiological weapons were disadvantaged, probably by a preference in all 5 of the countries that we looked at, for weapons resembling bullets and bombs rather than those that rely on less visible physical properties to do the killing. So Frank Smith in his work has called this a kinetic warfare bias. And although he doesn't look at radiological weapons specifically, he finds that it applies to neutron bombs, which share with radiological weapons a reliance on factors other than explosions to kill. So Hannah, I'm going to hand it back to you for some other observations.
Sure, I'll be quick in the interest of time because we also want to come back to Professor Potter. But in terms of some other findings that we can draw from looking across the 5 cases, of course, in all cases, we find that the principal motivation that motivated states to look at the radiological weapons were their perceived security imperatives. But of course, individuals and institutional advocates mattered for the pursuit of those weapons. So what we see in each of the US, Soviet, and Iraqi cases is what you could call a small set of issue entrepreneurs whose strong advocacy for radiological weapons mattered for initially securing funding and building support for this endeavor in the military industrial community. On the US side, those individuals tended to be scientists. On the Soviet and the Iraqi side, they were government officials. Perhaps the most important role that we found across our cases is in the Iraqi case, where Hussein Kamal, this individual sitting atop the MIC and the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission, he was really key to propelling this effort forward. So individuals and institutional advocates. But of course, domestic politics and advocacy is not static. It changes over time. And so what we also found is that there was what you could call a substitution effect at play across many of the cases that we looked at, where support for radiological weapons, which was initially there, lost traction, and then also budgetary support over time, especially in the US, the Soviet, and the UK case, which we haven't talked about today, where policymakers tended to put greater emphasis on nuclear weapons programs. And then also in the Soviet, the US, the UK, and the Iraqi case, eventually chemical weapons were simply judged to be more cost effective than continuing down the path of radiological weapons, which seemed so hard to be manufactured successfully.
Thanks. I'm going to try to wrap up in 5 minutes, so we will have stayed within our prescribed time. For those of you who want to hear more about this, by the way, we're having a similar but longer seminar in Monterey at 12 tomorrow. So let me know and we'll send you the link and you can hear a more extended version of this talk. What I really wanted to cover in the kind of my concluding remarks is, one, the impact of the war in Ukraine on radiological weapons. And while I had prepared a longer version of these remarks, I'll simply note that while our study of these comparative cases was initially conceived of primarily as an historical work, the coincidence in time between the actual invasion of Ukraine and the initiation of assertions by the Russian media about alleged Ukrainian efforts to develop and employ a radiological weapon, they corresponded perfectly in time, and they gave an urgency and a currency to our work, and that led us to kind of look at the implications of what we had seen in the past in a somewhat different light. And that includes the assertions that one reason why Russia occupied the Chernobyl nuclear facility was that Ukraine was, in fact, using that facility for the purposes of developing a radiological weapon. There were similar accusations about why they attacked and occupied the Zaporizhia facility. And I can say more about that media campaign in the Q&A if you're interested. I think initially this was done more for domestic political consumption to justify the invasion. What is interesting is that although there was a kind of a pause in the frequency of these assertions in the spring, by the fall of 2022, you found the same arguments being made, but at a very, very different level. You had Defense Minister Shoigu, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and October 26, even President Putin making these claims. There was a communication to the UN Secretary General about this, which actually had the most detailed assertions, which were very, very strange because the technical material associated with these claims were ridiculous. They clearly were not prepared by people who were technologically savvy, but it also gave the Ukrainians the opportunity to then ask the IAEA to, in fact, investigate those facilities, and they did, and they found absolutely nothing that was suspicious. And so we may want to talk about why the Russians chose to do that, but I'm going to skip over that section here. The only thing I will say further, I guess, with respect to the Ukraine case, and this is even somewhat controversial amongst our group here, but my impression is that it would be imprudent to assume that the attention that the Russians have given to this issue has not been reviewed carefully by Ukrainian policymakers, who, as best we can tell, had absolutely never pursued or had any interest in radiological weapons. But the fact that the Russians have highlighted that makes me quite concerned that while there is no potential in the near term, certainly for Ukraine to acquire a nuclear weapons capability, that it's not within, or it is not beyond the realm of the possible for them to at least, contemplate the virtues of a radiological weapon, although we have identified all kinds of reasons why that would not make any sense. So we have no evidence of this, but I think it's at least worth flagging, not only for Ukraine, but other countries also who may be interested in weapons of a non-conventional nature and who may not yet have read our book to identify all of the reasons why this may not be a very sound approach to pursue. The last thing that I want to mention, though, is the question of legal restraints. And it's interesting because when Sarah and I published another volume in 2018, looking at US Soviet and US Russian cooperation in the nonproliferation realm, we explored a case where the United States and the Soviet Union actually negotiated a draft convention, which they submitted to the precursor of the Conference on Disarmament, a Committee on Disarmament in Geneva, that called for a prohibition on the development, stockpiling, and use of radiological weapons. It ultimately foundered, after many years being considered on the calendar of the CD, over issues of scope, definitional questions, and also the Israeli attack on Osiris didn't help gain additional allies for this particular text. So we might want to look at that in the Q&A period. But I mentioned that kind of fast forwarding to this past fall, where it turns out that some of our friends in the State Department appear to have been aware of the work that we were doing for this book and decided that the time was ripe to revisit this issue in terms of multilateral diplomacy. And so at the most recent meeting of the first committee of the General Assembly in New York this fall, the United States, after going back and forth with various parties, gained 38 co-sponsored and issued a draft or introduced a draft resolution on radiological weapons, which very closely resembles the earlier US-Soviet initiative. What was striking in this instance was that the final version of the resolution was adopted by a vote of 159 to 5, with only 13 abstentions. The 5 naysayers were Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. China, interestingly, abstained. And I think one has to be wary of being very optimistic about how this initiative will fare at the Conference on Disarmament, given the manner of decision-making, consensus-based decision-making, and the sorry record of a stalemate since 1996. It does at least have a second life there. And I would not say it's beyond the realm of the possible that should things get kind of tied up, as they most certainly are likely to develop, that they may consider creation of an experts group on the subject. And they may also seek to kind of create various coalitions of the willing who might seek commitments on not pursuing radiological weapons, but could even imagine the notion of radiological-free, weapons-free zones being considered. So in conclusion, I would simply note that at this time, perhaps the best that we can accomplish as academics in the field is to shed some light on the impediments that were faced by past would-be radiological weapons proliferators to discourage new states from investing in them in the first place. So why don't I conclude on that note? I think we still have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. So I'll let our moderator call upon the questioners.
All right. Well, first, let's thank the. All right. For those of you who are in the ether or dialing in via the video, if you have questions, please enter those in the question and answer section, and I'll try to weave your questions into the discussions in the room. We'll follow the normal CSAC procedure. 1 finger is to start a new topic. 2 is to jump the queue and comment on something that's already been said. Please identify yourself before you ask your question. And the first few questions will go to fellows. Please.
Thank you for the talk today. Josh Glonick, a visiting scholar here and a U.S. military officer. I'm interested in your explanation on why these weapons were ultimately not adopted. You explained, Sarah, that when they were tested, they worked as intended in the sense that it deployed the radiological material over its intended target. But could you explain more of what these weapons do to their targets? And was there like a moral or humanitarian opposition that might have contributed to these weapons not being deployed, even if they might have worked? Similar to, you know, we don't use flamethrowers, even though, you know, they'll kill their target, but we don't think we should burn people alive. So was that ever something that you found in any of the research that contributed to why these weapons weren't used?
Should we collect a few, or do you want to go one by one?
Let's go one by one.
Sure. So I can start with this, but it's certainly an issue that we kind of looked at across the cases because it was part of something that we talk about in the conclusions of our book. In the US case specifically, it was really interesting to try to parse out what the implications of perhaps a norm against radiological weapons were, if any. So we did find some evidence that there was kind of revulsion about the idea of radiological weapons, similar to the idea I was describing about this kinetic warfare bias. But from what we were able to discern, there didn't seem to be it didn't seem like a robust enough norm emerged to actually have an impact on decisions around whether or not to mass produce and deploy radiological weapons. I came across a really fascinating sort of commentary that had been written in the New Yorker in the 1950s that was sort of talking about how unsavory radiological weapons were. It was in response to an article that had been published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And so there definitely was this feeling that there's something kind of gross about these weapons, similar to how people feel about chemical weapons. But we don't see that that emerged in a significant enough way to have actually shaped the innovation process. And maybe others can talk about some of that in their cases as well.
Let me just mention one thing. I was just double checking on the figures. It's interesting. I think it was actually Barton Bernstein who made reference in a 1985 article in the Technology Review, which alleges that there was communication in the 1940s between Oppenheimer and Hamilton, in which Oppenheimer argues that if this poison, this substance was to be used for military purposes, it would only be worthwhile if it killed at least 500,000 individuals. Something that I don't think we saw in the film, but it's an interesting kind of element with respect to the moral
Yeah.
considerations.
I would just like to put a two-finger into this discussion. So from your summary, it appears that radiological weapons disappeared because they failed to deliver on their technological promise. But looking to the technologies today, particularly medical technologies in cancer treatment, where we design molecules or nanoparticles to make very specific targets, different organs, different people, different types of damage. Could you speculate on whether there's yet ahead some next regime of innovation where the chemistry and radiation advances come together, or is that off the table completely?
In a military context or in a peaceful uses context?
Military.
I mean, first of all, you have to ask about, the bureaucratic politics within the militaries in terms of the adoption of weapon systems. And so we did really find the substitution effect to be very powerful. And so countries that usually pursued multiple kinds of non-conventional weapons at the same time, once they acquired a nuclear weapon, services were no longer interested in radiological weapons. The chief competitor and the military branch that was most often engaged in radiological weapons development was in the chemical weapons sector. But again, in terms of the consideration of the military mission, chemical weapons were kind of the tried and true weapon. And so that also undercut the military interest in radiological weapons. I think it's a question, and this kind of relates to the first point that I made in terms of non-state actors and state actors. If you're talking about a military useful weapon, it's less obvious to me, and I'm not a technical expert, about how the advances that you mentioned will necessarily impact upon the attractiveness of radiological weapons versus other kinds of military instruments. It has to do with the missions of the different services. So it may be easier. We'd have to consult with other parties on that point. I'm not aware of research on that at this moment, but maybe Hanna or Sarah.
No, I'm not. Definitely not.
Thanks very much. Lindsay.
Do you want, Hanna, do you want to?
Oh,
Yeah, I know. I mean, just on the Middle East,
Uh-huh.
moral considerations. I mean, that was largely untrodden territory in the early 60s when the Egyptians looked at it. So we have no evidence. We know that the scientist Yoklek, when he defected, cited moral qualms about sort of realizing what the Egyptians were up to. And we know that Nasser, when criticized for recruiting German scientists to help him with non-conventional weapons, sort of said, well, look, everyone's working with the German scientists. They also help the Russians. So there appeared to be this sort of rejection of moral arguments. The Iraqis were using chemical weapons extensively in the 80s. I think there was a perception that they could get away with a lot or were not being criticized by the international community very strongly, even though they refer to chemical weapons as special weapons. So there appears to have been some sort of sentiment on the Iraqi side that those were, they didn't want to refer to them as chemical weapons, which makes you wonder why. But from the record, there's no evidence that there were moral qualms about a radiological weapons capability.
Thank you. Now back to Lindsay.
Yeah, on the US side, did you see if there was any spillover from the conclusion of the RDD program to isomer hafnium weapon programs? Because that's another area that, it kind of make me wonder if some of the entrepreneurs just kind of went and started working on that, because that started up in the 50s. So there might be like some connection there.
Oh my God, Lindsay, you would be better to tell me than vice versa. But in my own research, no, I did not see any evidence of that. But our colleague Sam Meyer, who's not here with us, did a lot of that preliminary research on the US side. So I'd be happy to ask him that question. And you might have to write it down for me though.
And then for another question, so on the qualitative side, like of whether something actually has to be technically sound, I mean, something that I think would be a distinction across the cases is for the countries specifically that don't have nuclear weapons, was there any sort of kind of recognition that maybe it doesn't have to be perfect? It just has, you have to have it so that if the value is a deterrent, then does it actually have to work, or does it just have to ostensibly be there and maybe work?
Right before I open it up to the wider audience here in the room, let me read a question that's come in so they have a chance. This is from Jim Lamson.
He's our CNS colleague.
Okay.
Hi, Jim.
I'm going to shorten this question a little bit. How might a state pursue a latency hedging strategy for radiological weapons without crossing the threshold to actual weaponization?
Well, I mean, looking historically at this, I mean, there were two, or I guess in the case of, Egypt, three kind of basic approaches. In some ways, the easiest approach, if you wanted to kind of camouflage the activity, would be to make use of waste products. And so you would be able, I mean, there's an enormous amount of potentially usable waste materials that could, with the correct investment, might resemble what was used, say, by the Russians, and also was conceived of by the British as an approach. It gets a little bit more tricky when you're talking about the delivery systems for these particular weapons, but one certainly could take a number of steps in the direction of a weapon system without it becoming very observable, I would guess. But Hanna, you wanted to weigh in here?
I wanted to weigh in on Lindsay's question,
Oh,
but I can do that
sorry.
after. Or
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'm cognizant of the time, and I want to hear, Scott's critique here at some point, but go ahead, please.
I mean, just in terms of those who don't have nuclear weapons, at what point is a radiological weapons capability good enough? It depends on what you want it for. So the Iraqis very clearly wanted it for area denial in a war. They tested the bombs, they took radiation readings on the ground, they were too low, the bomb was too heavy, it just wasn't feasible. So it needed to be good enough for that. The Egyptians appear to have wanted it for sort of a deterrent weapon vis-a-vis Israel, though deterrence in a very fuzzy fashion, it wasn't really spelled out what they actually meant. And so I think Nasser said, even in a meeting with a US official at one point, he'd looked at something between TNT and a nuclear warhead, something in between, but they couldn't get there. And so people took that to mean that he was talking about a radiological weapon. But if you want it for deterrent purposes, it might not have to be perfect. If you want to actually use it, then...
The other point here, just with respect to Jim, I mean, and this relates to the importance of the US initiative. I mean, at the moment, there is no legally binding restrictions. And so if you're a non-nuclear weapon state, you're concerned about security assurances and the like, you observe things that are worrisome, let's say in Ukraine, one could move toward a radiological weapons program without fearing that you were in any way transgressing, legally binding restraints. So not that it would make sense, but some countries might see this as a relatively safer and easier path technically as well as politically.
Jim?
Hi, Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar here. Great to see all three of you. Congrats on the book. So I want to make sure that the takeaway I have is the one I'm supposed to have. So Bill started with, a presentation at Wilton Park that gave him pause, but concern, got to look into this topic. And you finished your presentation. I thought, okay, one less thing to worry about because countries were pursuing them, didn't really work well, petered out in the US and the Soviet Union. so I can go worry about something else. So if that's not the takeaway I'm supposed to have, I would appreciate the clarification.
I mean, it's interesting. We did a piece that was a companion piece to the book launch with Foreign Affairs. They made up the title. And their title was Why the World Should Still Worry About Dirty Bombs with Radiological Weapons, States, Not Terrorists, Pose the Main Risk. The subtitle was not ours at all, and we would really quarrel with that. I think that we try to identify the various impediments that have occurred in the past, at the same time that we note why some countries may still retain an interest in the pursuit of these weapons. And I think it's in part a function of the erosion of nuclear norms generally, which we observe in Ukraine, the collapse of other institutions that have given us some kind of hope with respect to nonproliferation today that make us worry about this. And I would say we don't really address this in the book, but there may be technological innovations that could also alter, the calculus. But more than anything, it's an issue that surprisingly has not been addressed. Without mentioning names, we know major figures in the field, both in terms of the countries that we've looked at and who are technical experts who were totally unaware of the programs that had taken place that we identify in the book. So we think it is important to shine light on what happened in the past and to think through carefully what may happen in the future. One other thing, and this is related to some of the work that I think Scott has done in the chemical weapons area and with respect to your commitment trap and the like, with respect to deterrence. And interestingly, Bernard Brodie was one of the very few people who in the 50s looked at the question of radiological weapons. But it's a question of deterrence. I mean, there is no, best of our knowledge, talking with people in the US government, there's been no thought about how you deter radiological weapons. There are no red lines because nobody's really even thought about the issue. So we think that's another thing that merits attention, Jim.
We're near the end of the hour, so Scott's next in line, and you wanted to have a few words from Scott, so we'll give Scott the last question.
Well, I don't have a critique because I think this is really exciting, and it's just a compliment because this is novel and really important work, and you should be congratulated. I do have a question though, and it's about to Hanna about this idea about nuclear issue entrepreneurs. What I've learned from reading both Saddam's tapes and the work of Melfred Braut Haghammer is how often entrepreneurs exaggerated the effectiveness of what they were doing. Why? Because Saddam wanted to know that something was really effective, and so they, being yes men, they had to exaggerate it and stuff like that. Why didn't that? Did you find that happening there? And if not, why not? Or did you find it happening elsewhere?
No, I mean, I cite Mulfred's book and also Jacques Hyman's, people who looked at the institutional context in which the Iraqi nuclear program materialized, to sort of infer from that similar dynamics might have been at play in the radiological weapons program. We don't have enough evidence to really trace sort of the lines of reporting and the lines of progress in that program to have such a fleshed out analysis as Mulfred provides on the nuclear program. But certainly it's conceivable that Hussein Kamal, who sat on top of this whole effort and who was known to be sort of a tyrant, and people probably didn't dare to report failure or lack of progress to him, that dynamic might have been at play in the radiological weapons program as well. Yeah.
Right, thank you. That brings us to the end of the hour. There's still a few questions out there, so I'd invite you to ask them afterwards. The speakers will still be here, but let's thank the speakers again for very exciting.